The common cold, or acute nasal pharyngitis to give it its proper name, has been a scourge of humans on this planet for many, many years now. On average, adults will get between 2 and 4 colds a year, and children will get between 6 and 12 colds a year, so it's something that virtually everyone has had on this planet at any time during a year. Now, a question that I'm often asked as a scientist is how come scientists can put a man on the moon, and yet they can't seem to find a cure for the common cold? What I'm going to do now is hopefully outline the reasons why we haven't found a cure for the common cold, maybe debunk some old wives' tales as to potential cures and treatments for it, and maybe show you one or two that might have some truth in them. So the origins of the common cold, well, it was first studied in the 16th century when King James I of England appeared to exhibit persistent cold-like symptoms throughout his life. The irony being now that if he had that many cold symptoms, we now think that he probably didn't have a cold at all. He certainly had some immune deficiency disease, but it was nothing to do with the common cold that we now have. Anyway, that's where the term came from. It's a highly infectious disease. It's viral, which means antibiotics won't work on it because they only work on bacteria. Now, viruses are much, much smaller than bacteria. They primarily consist of a single strand of RNA with a coat of protein around them. And there's some debate as to whether they even count as alive or not. Bacteria, on the other hand, are much bigger and they're much more complex organisms and are very much alive. So colds exist due to this viral infection, which goes through your upper respiratory tract, and primarily it gestates, which means it's multiplying, in the back of your throat in that nasal passage. The primary method of entry is through the nose, rather than through anything else, and your nose is the primary barrier that you have to prevent cold symptoms coming. Now, the runny nose, the headaches, etc., the things that you associate with a cold are not actually due to the virus itself, but they're due to the immune response that your body produces in the virus. So that's why the virus will incubate in your system before you realize that you have it. Because as this virus is multiplying, it takes a while for your body to produce the immune response. And when it does, that's when you get all the symptoms of a runny nose, etc. In most healthy people, it can take between 1 and 2 weeks to clear up. For some people, it can be more serious, particularly if they've got other pre-existing conditions or if they're young children. So the reasons why children in particular get colds as opposed to adults, in fact the elderly get very few colds, is that you can build up some kinds of immunity to colds. Now, there's not one particular virus that causes a cold. There's many, many types, and these evolve over time. And so you can become immune to one particular type of virus that will cause the common cold, but that doesn't mean that you're immune to another one. And so places where people are mixing from different areas, so for example, the first term at university leads to this disease known as freshers' flu, which actually is usually just a number of colds that come from different regions that people haven't acquired immunity to. And once you're put in close proximity to all those people, then things such as colds gets transmitted really, really easily. You're 4 times more likely to catch a cold in the winter than in the summer. In fact, that's where the name cold comes from. It comes from the temperature of the cold, which is funny because there doesn't seem an obvious reason as to why that should be. The reasons for years that many people thought that people got colds more in winter was because people spent more time indoors. They had the windows shut, which meant that the air wasn't circulating as freely with the outside, and that people spent more time in close proximity to each other. And that meant that it was possible to transmit this virus between people and between objects much easier than in the summer when you spend a lot of time outdoors and there's a lot of air blowing through houses. And whilst we still believe that's a factor, there's been some recent research which indicates another quite sensible reason for why you tend to get more colds in winter. And that's that the primary defense mechanism of your body is found in the nasal lining inside your nose. Now, when it's cold, the moisture inside your nose tends to dry up, and this means that its ability to respond to a virus is significantly decreased, which means that your body's defense mechanisms aren't as good as they could have been otherwise. So that is another reason why we tend to get more colds in the wintertime. Having said that, in recent years, with the advent of the widespread use of air conditioning in hot countries and also in countries that previously would never have it, we might begin to see more colds arise in the summer. And that's because air conditioning, blowing that air around, even though it might be hot air, is doing the same thing. It's drying out the nasal lining in your nose, which will make you more likely to pick up a cold. So is there any truth in the fact that when you're chilled, you're going to get cold if you go out in the cold? Well, there is some truth, but it's not necessarily what you might think it is. There are many cases and many people who will have a cold virus and they won't show any symptoms of it at all because their body is so good at fighting it off that the virus doesn't get a hold, it doesn't multiply and multiply. You have millions and millions of virus particles in your body when you exhibit a cold symptoms. Now, say for example that you had a bit of this cold virus in you, but not enough to cause symptoms, and then you spent a long period of time being chilled, being physically cold. Well, then that can cause the blood vessels inside your nose and inside all of your body to become constricted. There's less blood pumping through it. And this can dry out the moisture in your nose as well as the back of your nasal passage. And this means that the virus might have a chance to get a cold, to develop and provide symptoms for you. So being chilled means that you have a higher chance of the symptoms of a cold if you already carry the cold. But because it's an active virus, if you don't have it in you, you can get as cold as you like physically, and you won't get a cold unless this virus enters your system. So in terms of prevention, the major thing that the World Health Organization recommends is hand washing. That's the primary method to prevent the transmission of the disease. The viruses can live not just in the air, but also the three main places where they can be caught up in built-up areas are on door handles, on taps, and on handsets for telephones. So those are places where the virus can live for a number of hours, depending on the virus. And if someone has the virus on their hands from touching their face, puts it down, then another person can pick it up and contact the virus that way. So hand washing is a key way before you touch your face or before you eat food. Particularly if you have a cold, it's really important to wash your hands so that you don't pass it on to many people. Stress has been shown to be a factor as well, and we think that's because stress promotes corticosteroids in your body, and they kind of pump through your body. And this is a side effect of lowering immunity, which means that you're more likely to contract a number of different diseases, including viruses such as the common cold. However, an interesting piece of research done recently in the University of Cardiff shows that one way that you'll not pick up a cold is through kissing people. And the reasons for this is that there's enough material in the saliva which prevents the virus becoming live and becoming active, and so you actually stand very, very little chance of contracting a cold by kissing someone with a cold. However, if you do happen to touch their tear ducts or their nose or their hands, then you probably will. So it's still something to be careful of there. Now, there's been a number of old wives' tales around, a number of traditional cures to the cold, and I want to go through a little bit of the science of them, and we can look at which ones work and which ones don't. So originally, Maimonides, a 12th century Jewish philosopher, stated as follows: chicken soup is recommended as an excellent food as well as medication. So there's an example of a time where chicken soup was considered primarily medicinal for diseases such as the cold. However, as we know nowadays, chicken soup makes wonderful, nutritious food, but doesn't really have any medicinal properties. So we've come a long way since then. Another method that's often used by people to treat colds is taking lots and lots of vitamin C. And whilst it's true that vitamin C is involved in getting rid of infection, the fact is that on virtually every diet, particularly Western diets, there is no deficiency of vitamin C at all. And so taking more vitamin C is going to make pretty much no difference at all. Eucalyptus and steam inhalation are a way that people use to clear congestion in your nasal passages, particularly if you've got a blocked nose. And it's true that those kind of treatments can decongest yourself. However, they make no effect on the virus, so you'll still have a cold for the same length of time. And they make no effect on your other symptoms, I'm afraid. It's literally just a decongestant. So those are a few things which old wives' tales that don't seem to be true. The primary thing that people are advised to do actually is keep hydrated. It's to keep water in your system. Sufficient water in your system is the quickest way and virtually the only way that you can use to encourage your body to get rid of this virus faster. Now, one old wives' tale that I want to turn to is that of feed a cold, starve a fever. Now, there's been some research to show that perhaps this could be true. Now, this origin of this saying is related to the fact that any feverish illness is likely to be associated to a loss of appetite. And this is due to the actions of circulating cytokines, which are released from the white blood cell. Now, most colds in adults are not associated with fever, and so there's not so much of a loss of appetite. Now, Dr. Gies van der Brink of the Academic Medical Center in Amsterdam has published a paper recently. You can look it up if you get the chance. It's in Clinical Diagnostic Laboratory Immunology, and it's volume 9, and begins at page 182. And he did an interesting experiment. What he did was he told 6 people to fast overnight, and then he gave them a diet of either liquid water, obviously, or liquid foods, such as soup or pureed food. And then 6 hours later, he analysed the blood from these people to see what kind of immune responses they had after having that time fasting. And this is what he discovered, and it was very interesting. The patients who he fed the liquid food to showed a 4-fold increase in something called gamma interferon, and this is known to be involved in combating viral infections such as a cold. Now, the people who were fed water, so they had been fasting then for nearly 12 hours, they showed a similar 4-fold increase, but not in gamma interferon, in something else called interleukin-4. Now, this is involved in combating threats found outside human cells, but primarily bacterial infections, and it's bacterial infections which are a common cause of fever. So it would seem that actually by starving a fever, then you're allowing your body to still produce this interleukin-4. Now, the reason for this is still unclear. I have to stress it's still been a preliminary study, and there's more work that we as a scientific community have to do to understand it. But it might be to do with an energy-saving capacity. So viruses such as the cold are not particularly as serious as generally as bacterial infections, and so the body might decide that it can wait until it has food in its body before it produces its immune response. Whereas bacterial infections tend to be more serious, and so the body makes a decision, so to speak, that it can't wait for food, and so it still has to produce this immune response to the bacteria. So that's an example of this feed a cold, starve a fever, old wives' tale that might indeed have some scientific background to it. It doesn't entirely hold true, as some viruses such as influenza can cause a fever, but as a general case, perhaps there is some level of truth in it. So, are we ever going to get a cure for the cold? Well, it's not looking very likely, I have to be honest with you. It's not like something like smallpox where we can develop a vaccine, because smallpox is only caused by one particular organism. Now, colds are caused by many, 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 and so it's very hard to develop a vaccine that will work against all of them. Even if there was a way to treat a cold, unfortunately, by the time your symptoms manifest, it's probably too late because they've already peaked in your body. So the way you'd want to treat a cold is before you actually knew that you had it. And even if there was a treatment designed for the cold, it would probably be reserved just for hospital infections, for people who are seriously ill with other things, so that the virus didn't acquire some immunity and resistance to the drugs. And finally, because of the licensing laws, because the cold is generally not that serious, this means that virtually no side effects would be tolerated by the licensing authorities, which means it'd be very, very hard to get a drug to market past them. And as such, the economics of it means that a number of big pharmaceutical companies are not choosing to invest in research in this area at the moment. So there is a good opportunity, if you're watching, to perhaps take up a career in pharmaceuticals, and you can help all of us in the planet by finding a way to treat or to cure the common cold. So that's basically it. I want to leave you with one question to get you thinking, and that's this. If you imagine the world in 50 years' time, do you think we're going to see more instances of the cold or less? I'll leave it to you. Thank you for listening.